everyone, welcome to Questioning Mind. I'm Sagorika, your host, and today I'm joined by Gokul Sahni, our first guest on this channel. Gokul, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Gokul is an international relations expert based out of Singapore. He's pursued his MBA from the University of Oxford. He's done his international relations from Singapore's NTU. And he is also pursuing his MA in War Studies from King's College, Department of War Studies. And he is here today to discuss international relations and how India is poised to take on the international strategic relations with various allies and non-allies. And thank you so much for joining me. We will get started now.
Thank you so much, Sagorika. I just wanted to wish you the best of luck for this YouTube series that you're starting. I know you'll be covering a lot of topics, not just foreign policy, but also domestic politics. So really looking forward to see how this channel goes from strength to strength.
Thanks so much, and thank you for getting me that boost. So today, though, we will be focused on international relations. You're domain expert. You're the domain expert here, so I'm going to give you a lot of screen time. So let's begin. So we're just going to start with something that is simple and a bit of an overview. So according to you right now, today, currently, what are some of the most significant actions in terms of international relations that India has taken over the last 2 years? And of course, you know, the strategy has changed over the decades, and over the last 7 years, it's been slightly different from how it was before due to the change in the government at the center. But over the last 2 years, do you see anything specifically that is different? How do you see what India is doing on international forums so far?
Sure, Sagorika. So if I just take a zoomed out view and just have a look at what Indian foreign policy is doing, you would see that we've become a lot more direct and a lot more obvious about what our interests are. I think given our legacy around non-alignment, which later became strategic autonomy, there was always this effort of trying to hedge our bets with various partners, try to make sure that we get along with everyone. Now, the single biggest change that happened in last June at the Galwan Valley, where according to me, it was a localized incident that went out of control. I do not believe that there was any grand plan for that event to happen. But the way after it happened, I can see a sea change in Indian foreign policy elites and at the domestic level, that a rising China is antagonistic to India, and we need to orient our foreign policy accordingly. I do believe that a lot of foreign policy elites in India were already thinking about this, but there was a sense that there is a lot for India to prosper if it works constructively with China. And to be honest, I'm in that camp where I believe that there's no point in being too much of a hawk with a country that's always going to be your neighbor.
Yeah, so you were saying that there's a lot that can be gained. I'm sure you mean economically, but do you hold that point of view now that the situation has in fact escalated, and with BRI in full progress, and it's wreaking havoc, frankly, in a lot of Chinese allies or debt trap nations that China has sort of trying to wherever China is trying to accomplish that BRI in a big way. It's not really gone too well for their client nations. So in that sense, do you think India should keep that point of view, knowing that we need not be so hawkish about our neighbor?
Yeah, so obviously there's a difference between the short-term approach and the long-term approach over here. I think the short-term approach that India is doing right now is the correct approach, whether it was banning apps or it's putting in some enhanced restrictions when it comes to trade and investment from the Chinese side, because obviously, as External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has said, that we can't go back to normal just with having so many troops on the border. But in the medium to longer term, Sagorika, I do think that there has to be constructive economic engagement with China. One of my arguments has been that it's important for India to cultivate at least some of the business lobbies in Shanghai, in major Chinese cities that look to India as a major market, at least in non-strategic areas. That could act as a bit of a break for PLA expansionism in the region. For your point exactly about the BRI and projects that China funds, I don't think anyone is asking for India to become part of the Belt and Road Initiative. I just don't see that happening. Yes. I personally do look at some of the isolated cases that happen in various countries such as Sri Lanka or Kenya as cases where those countries have made their own mistakes. They've not made their own due diligence. At the end of the day, if money is given to you as a loan and not a grant, that money has to be repaid. And if that money is not repaid, then that creditor is entitled to taking their action. So I find it a little pointless to blame the creditor over there, because they did not force the debtor country to take those that particular funding. But when I talk more about India and China in terms of economic relations, I actually believe in learning from China that despite having not always friendly relations with Japan or the US, it's been able to build up its economy by basically separating the fact that you don't need to like your economic trading partner that much. And at the end of the day, as India slowly becomes the world's third largest economy, China is the world's second largest economy, it would hurt India to essentially boycott China and Chinese economy. So in the longer term, I am more in favor of more constructive engagement in the economic region, but of course, not in sectors that are essential to India's security and defense.
Thanks, Gokul. So my question with regards to BRI was from the perspective of Gwadar and the fact that it's quite unstable, and to ensure that gets completed, they would have to go through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir in some, portions of their BRI. But I get what you're saying about China being an economic powerhouse. And from what I understand in terms of trade, especially when it comes to apparently private entities operating from a purely economic perspective, I think India's been relatively open, and that's come at the expense of some brickbats in the Indian media as well. We've not really closed out economic relations with China at this point, right?
So do you mean more in terms of Indian corporates in China?
No, I mean Chinese corporates in India, they are functioning. We've got a lot of export deficit. We've got a lot of deficit with China at this point, right? So
no, absolutely, and that's something that needs to be rectified at the same time. And I know this dovetails with a larger point that India is a bit reluctant with free trade agreements in the region, and that is that India by itself needs to boost its own competitiveness as well as its own exports. They've kind of stabilized at a particular level, and as the economy is growing, exports are not growing in tandem with that. So I think it's generally a little bit of a cop out to say that, oh, we don't like trade because we just keep importing and we don't export. I think the onus is on India and the Indian economy. And I don't just mean the government and the public sector. I also mean the private sector of producing goods and services that are of world-class standard, that they can be exported to other countries to address the trade deficit. Now, of course, for the China case, there is more politics involved, but just on a general level, India's large trade deficit also has to do with the fact that it is not able to get its exports up to the right level that it wants.
Absolutely. So this helps me segue into a question that I did want to ask about the free trade agreements in the rest of the ASEAN region. So we lack that. We've been stagnated there since years, almost decades right now. We haven't really made good on any of the free trade agreements that we had drawn up. We've done some mistakes with, the ones that we had previously, ensuring that we had increased our trade deficit in that region. So what do you think about are there any changes to the policy making in that direction? I don't even see a lot of effort in the ASEAN region, frankly. And Bangladesh, China, they've made use of this South Asian region and their trade agreements in the region pretty aggressively as compared to what we have done. How much more can we do at this point? Do you see any effort being put in that direction?
So I can tell you that at least in recent months, it really seems to be going off the agenda. And sitting in Singapore, one of the major pangs of disappointment I could sense, not just from Singapore, but just from ASEAN, the region as a whole, is when India pulled out of RCEP. Now, India has its own reasons to pull out of RCEP. The number one reason was that it was afraid that Chinese goods would enter through the back door and it would worsen the trade deficit. But we have to realize that free trade agreements are not just completely about economics, they're also about politics. India's leaving RCEP in some sense showed that, is India really a responsible enough stakeholder for the rules-based order in Asia or not? And there were a number of conversations that I could see where people were just disappointed that India is choosing to just keep itself in a protectionist way and not understanding that if it has to grow as a major power, it has to grow in tandem with many of the other countries that are there in the region. For whatever reason, I can make out that the current political dispensation in India believes that the free trade agreements that it has signed, it's actually lost out on.
Yes.
I don't think it should be so black and white. I don't think that you should blame increasing imports and stagnating exports completely on the other side. I think there is cause for introspection that's there. But I would say that there's no point of getting too lost within is an FTA signed or not, but actually focus on the overall economic engagement in the region, both in terms of trade, both in terms of investment, both in terms of our Indian companies moving overseas. So again, not everything, just because you sign an FTA mean everything is okay. Just because you don't sign an FTA doesn't mean that there's no economic engagement. But there's definitely a lot more that India can do in the region.
So you're saying that apart from the FTAs, a lot of onus is on the private players, on general the protectionist policies that India is taking. But don't you think that in order to sort of bolster the Indian production export ecosystem, we do need a little bit of protectionism? That's something that America has done in the past, and that's something that we've not been able to do with a lot of the. Well, we do lack manufacturing capacity, production capacity in general, and it's only now that capex is, sort of being released a little bit, and maybe we are being protectionist, but isn't that supposed to end up boosting our exports a little bit, or do you expect that it's so long term that it's not going to hold any economic benefits at this time?
So, Sagorika, if you look at most of the Asian economies that have had impressive growth, and I'm not even talking about a Singapore, which in some sense is an economic miracle, or Japan when it was going to 60 or 70s. Let's talk about how Bangladesh is doing now. Bangladesh has been able to find one champion sector, RMG, ready-made garments, which is about 80 to 85% of its exports. It's now the world's second largest exporter after China. Now, India should introspect that how come Bangladesh is able to export more ready-made garments than India is able to. But the point is, a lot of economies, whether Bangladesh, whether Thailand, whether Malaysia, have understood that a certain level of export competitiveness is necessary. Now, in terms of having protectionism on an internal level, I think this is where India's scale goes against us, because it's so easy to become very, very rich just if you're a dominant player in India, that you don't really feel the need to go into smaller markets where there's higher levels of risk. I do hope this is changing. One of the things that I really enjoyed looking at of late was Adani Ports making an entry into Sri Lanka, where it's important to show that the giant Indian economy in South Asia is not just the government of India, but it's also Indian corporations that are going to other countries that can help us achieve our overall national interests. But at the same time, the private sector is able to do it at a level of efficiency, at a level of earning financial returns that are far greater than the public sector. So I would say protectionism in such a large country can lead to companies just getting quite lazy and quite, I would say, comfortable in the Indian market.
So we're just going to ignore
we would need them to start becoming more competitive.
With them trying to step into Myanmar.
Yeah, I mean, Myanmar is obviously a very, very different case.
Right.
Myanmar is actually an even more interesting case, because this is where India's interests come up against things like democracy promotion, or whether we toe the line with the West in terms of the rules-based order. My opinion on this is perhaps different from most. I don't believe India should be in the process of advising other countries or what political systems they should use. I think the current Indian government shows that it doesn't appreciate advice from other countries. So,
Right.
just to be consistent, it's probably not within New Delhi's remit to go in telling other countries how they should do. And just in terms of engagement, I did read in the media today that I think Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla will be going over there on a visit. I think that's very important. You can't choose your neighbors; they are who they are. You would have to go and engage with them, even if to some capitals in New York or London they don't appear as if
Right.
they are esteemed company, but we have to make do with where we live.
That is a very interesting point. Frankly, I do not see it that way. And thanks for bringing that to attention. And you're right, we can't actually choose our neighbors, and their business is their business. So we can't really play the game that we don't want to be part of. So I would be remiss to not bring up our recent deal spree with Russia. Does this buffer us against China in any way? I mean, of course, they have some of the largest defense sharing treaties in the works. They're ideological partners. Will this bolster our defense systems technically? And is that the only point? From an IR perspective, what do our deals actually say? And, having Putin travel abroad, I think almost after 2 years, is that's being made of as a very significant gesture. So what do you make of it?
So Russia is an interesting topic. If both countries were suddenly born in 2021, I don't think India or Russia would look to each other as partners. There are just so many differences today.
Right.
But that said, because there was a rosy past, because there's sentimentality, both sides find it in their interests to keep a particular relationship alive. Though I do see every year that's getting weaker and weaker. Now, in terms of military deals and purchases, I have a slightly different opinion. I don't see it. I don't expect Russia to be a buffer against China, because currently I see Russia and China working in tandem over a number of issues. And I think that we are coming to a point that if Russia is asked to choose between China and India, I actually think there will be no debate in Moscow. It's very clear China is more important. I think where Russia is important to India is that it does provide good military equipment, hardware that we just need anyway. And B, it's still a non-Western great power that often we are on the same side when it comes to various things around, whether it's human rights or democracy promotion or various aspects. Because while we are increasingly aligned with the West these days, we're not fully aligned with them. And if you see a number of UN General Assembly votes, we are often not aligned with the United States at all. So I would say take Russian equipment for what it's worth. There's no need to romanticize it. There's no need to say that, the Russians have always been there with us. I look at it more as a commercial relationship. There was an excellent article in the Times of India a week or two ago by Indrani Bagchi, where she spoke that the India-Russia relationship does very well when it comes to 20th century industries, but it is absolutely absent when it comes to 21st century industries, as India is looking to become richer as a digital economy, various types of privatization, modernization. There's very little that Russia can help us in. And I would also look towards Russia's actions in Ukraine and say, is this really what we'd like our a strategic partner to be doing? So I'm quite unsentimental when it comes to Russia, but at the same time, I don't see any reason of chucking it away just because the US doesn't want us to buy S-400s. Is not a good enough reason for us not to buy S-400s. If we believe it's in our national interest to buy them, I think we should do it. I do have one point to say about Russia-China relations. I think a lot of this is is being done with the fact that President Putin enjoys immense amount of power in Russia, and he's able to navigate the Russia-China relationship very carefully. If you would actually view, Russia has a much weaker hand than China, but diplomatically, it doesn't come across as if Russia is a junior partner of China. I think, Sagorika, that would change after President Putin. I think any future Russian leader will get slightly nervous about China. We'll probably see their future more in Europe and try and have some sort of, arrangement of sorts with Europe. And I think in a post-Putin era, there could be more cooperation, both US-Russia and India-Russia against China. But in the current era, I would not expect anything from Moscow vis-a-vis when it comes to New Delhi and Beijing. I think for that, it's quite clear that the US would be India's main partner.
All right, thanks. And this, again, since you mentioned us being on the opposite side of the Western, so-called Western powers at this time, do you think that having deals with pretty much all of our neighbors and then strategic allies such as Russia, does this still ensure that we remain in the non-aligned category with us participating in the Quad as well? Are we just doing it to prevent a unipolar world order, participating with Russia, US working parallelly, but sort of in the same direction to ensure that there is no Chinese hegemony and military expansionism at this time, which also, speaking of the Quad, is it useful at all at this point? Is it dead? Is it moving?
Sure.
Sorry, I just want to confirm that it was done at a time when, there was a lot of push from the then US establishment as well. And now we see, winds of change with at least India-US relations. Slight changes have happened. We have the new, I think, Ambassador Ellie Governor, who came in and said that he'd want to question human rights issues in the country and things like that, which was kind of unthinkable in the Trump era, which is when Quad started. So how useful is it now?
Sure. So two different set of questions. For the first one, about non-alignment, multipolarity, hegemony, I would say, like any other power, India wants to have its cake and eat it too. And what do I mean by that? The first part is that obviously India wants a multipolar world, because it does not want a unipolar world where it's just the US or China. It doesn't want a bipolar world either, where it doesn't have room to maneuver, but it wants a multipolar world because it views itself as becoming one of those poles.
Sure.
The second aspect is that one of the poles in this future multipolar world is appearing to be strategically against India. And it's quite evident that India can no longer be defined as non-aligned when it comes to China. I think India is very much aligned with other countries when it comes to China. And I think there is no better manifestation of this as the Quad. Now, I find the Quad quite interesting. Earlier, people said it would not come through. Then when it came through, people said, oh, it won't be a military alliance. And that's correct, but they're missing the point. The Quad cannot and should not become a military alliance of collective security. It's pretty simple. India shares a disputed land border with China. I don't think India expects any of the Quad members to ever come to its rescue. I don't think India wants any of them to come, and I don't think any of them are interested to. Similarly, while the US has always in Europe had a collective security structure, it's always been the hub and spoke model in Asia. So the US-Australia relationship is very, very independent, very different from the US-Japan relationship. And while both of them are alliances, no one can really describe the US-India relationship as an alliance. So I would say that if you're going to criticize the Quad by saying it's not an alliance, you're absolutely missing the point. The second point is I'm pretty bullish on the Quad because I think it's actually going in a slow and steady way. It doesn't need to be big bang. I think the idea that it's focusing on non-military issues such as maritime affairs, vaccines, overall governance, there was stuff about education. I think these are the building blocks of the liberal democracies in the region. I think this is basically showing countries that, yes, there's a particular Chinese model of doing stuff, and here's a non-Chinese model of doing stuff. Because if you actually look at it, there's not a lot in common between India, the US, Japan, and Australia. The glue holding this alliance, I've often said, is not containing China, but at the very least constraining China. So I think that's very much going to be there. But if people are expecting the Quad to become like an Asian NATO and Indo-Pacific NATO, that won't happen. And I don't think it's in India's interests either. To be honest, what happens in the Pacific Ocean and the South China Sea is not of immediate consequence to India. It is of secondary consequence. It is definitely important, but I'm not really sure New Delhi would contemplate sending Indian Navy ships so far away from our shores for defending countries with which India does not have security partnerships with.
Right. Now, I would also naturally think that it is a military alliance of any sort. However, with AUKUS, it's very well defined that there will be intelligence. With the Five Eyes alliance, there's the intelligence sharing. With AUKUS, there are defined parameters. What do we expect from Quad? And I know the meetings are happening only, well, as frequently as any other meetings, including RCI or something like that. So I don't know. It feels like it has tapered down from when it began, or its objectives have changed. Am I right in thinking that, or what's your
Sagorika, yeah, one point is that obviously I would say that despite moving from a Trump administration to a Democratic Biden administration, I think the US has shown commitment to the Quad. Now, the exact ideas may have changed slightly. I think that's only natural. But I'm pretty confident that it's going to stick around the course. Now, you brought up AUKUS, and one point that at least I want to clarify is that in these alliances, hierarchy matters. In AUKUS, it is very clear that the US is the senior partner and the UK and Australia are not. I don't think India is interested in an arrangement in the Quad where the US is the senior partner and India has to listen to it. There are various aspects because of our history of colonialism that makes us quite prickly over sovereignty. One may say that perhaps excessively so, but it's just a part of the Indian psyche. So just to give you an example, when they're talking about nuclear-powered submarines in AUKUS, what they're also talking about is, perhaps Australian sailors serving on US Navy ships, US Navy submarines docking in Australia more often. I don't think India would be comfortable doing that with any country. Even during the heights of the Cold War, despite the Soviets being close to India, at no point in time was India like, okay, let's have a Soviet naval base in India. So I think because of that, because of Indian reluctance to be a junior partner, and for us to say that we're equal partners, I just don't think that anyone should expect the Quad to become like AUKUS. And one other point, in AUKUS, the US and UK, and the US and Australia have had a security partnership for decades.
Right.
There is immense amount of trust. I mean, one example is that Australia has followed America into every war that it's gone to, whether in Vietnam, whether in Afghanistan or something. So these countries have incredibly high levels of military trust with each other. India does not. I would say that we've moved from distrust with the US to a large amount of trust, but we're probably never going to be a full alliance. So I don't expect us to ever have an AUKUS-like arrangement, but as a future great power, I think India would expect to develop its own both nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarines, so that it maintains its autonomy of doing what it wants to do as a major power.
I'm going to poke into this a little bit more, a little bit deeper, before I move on to a completely different topic. My question is basically, can you define what Quad stands for at this time?
Sure. I would say the Quad, implicitly, if not explicitly, is an organization of countries that have come together that are interested in controlling China's rise, that believe that China can have a malign influence from a security perspective, both in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And these four are the largest countries, the most powerful militaries in the region that are ready to stand up against China and who are ready publicly to tell China that they're ready to not poke it in the eye, but that they will stand up to Chinese aggression. For me, the fact that India is pretty enthusiastic with the Quad, that is a big deal. If we go back to the Manmohan Singh administration, I just don't see India being able to even have this level of conversations. And I would just remind everyone that we are now in an allied world where India does do alliances, but there was a time a few decades ago when India didn't recognize Israel, when India was shy of doing anything with the Western countries, that it just kept championing the global South always. And I think it's a pretty good point that we are moving away from arguments on colonization or racial equality, which of course were important at the time, but now moving towards our own growth and development as a major power. But if you're looking for a neat, snappy title for the Quad like AUKUS, I don't think that'll be available. But that's not a bug; that's a feature of the Quad.
No, I think what you said about, ensuring that China sort of stays in its lane as far as possible, I think all of the Quad nations have taken at least economic measures to ensure that, that is, they've made that position pretty clear. And they've also been, like you said, they've been public about their stance, not against China, so to speak, but, against China's hegemonic imposition in that sense. So yeah, I suppose that clarifies things. Now I'm going to go on to a completely different tangent. This is something that I've been, discussing on a couple of my videos as well. I'd like to discuss soft power and where India stands. Now, obviously with, vaccine diplomacy having done really well, frankly, in a lot of nations that would probably not even have considered India, forget strategic partner, India just wasn't in their sphere of, India would not think of being in their sphere of influence or anything, but it's really made us come up on the world stage. However, when it comes to the common man instead of, and the common woman, when it comes to something not, people not part of the political circle, they are used to consuming a lot of content that is based on, media, right? The national media, especially in different languages. Now, considering that France is such an important strategic ally, I have discussed, some of their coverage of, say, Le Monde or their national newspapers that are very anti-India. They've been consistently anti-India, regardless of the power, the governments at their center or the governments at our center. The same goes for some Japanese publications. Increasingly large number of Israeli publications. It's very low though. Israel does a lot of neutral coverage. I don't think they are very open to a lot of sensationalism in their news coverage. However, the tone seems to change, especially with news being disseminated through social media. There's a lot of influencers now affecting this world, and India has been pretty slow with countering narratives internally, but externally they've ensured that they don't do anything at all. So we've got a lot of anti-India betas sitting, say, in the Washington Post, sitting in the New York Times, and it seems like a controversial topic to bring these up today, but these are respected publications. And I was actually reading a foreign affairs article by Arvind Subramanian where he compares India's Atmanirbhar initiative to the licensed Raj, and they are so completely opposite in the sense that licensed Raj ensured that there was more nationalization as well as Atmanirbharta is so much more dependent on deregulation and private players coming in. So that's, my point of view is that it affects our soft power, the soft power that we wield, regardless of what we export in the form of yoga or vaccines. How do we change the minds of the common people? Do you think it's, China has done it amazingly well with their funds into a lot of Hollywood, a lot of education. So do we really need to be focusing on that now? Can we?
Sure, that's a long question. What I would say is, yeah, I've seen a lot of what you're mentioning. What I would say is, as a still very poor and developing country, and just the world's second largest population, there's a lot of easy negative news articles about India that can be found and that can be, that make for really bad sound bites. I would also say that Indian politicians always, even now, especially of the ruling party, have been prone to using statements, whether in election speeches or just overall, that when you read them in the cold, hard day in press, many of them look quite ridiculous. So I would say that India and its government does not do itself many favors by having this amount of rhetoric in the first place, or these amounts of events, whether it's violence against women, or how there are treatments around various religious or cultural minorities everywhere. But you bring up a second point, which is very important, and that is like, it seems that there is already a pre-existing slant that is just waiting for this level of negative news. That's really interesting. That's something I've seen myself also, because I always believe that there are pros and cons of both. There are pros and cons of developed countries, which is the US, or where I stay, Singapore. And similarly, there are pros and cons of developing countries like India as well. If all you're going to do is focus on the cons, then, and it's, especially when you belong to a country which has a history of its own level of colonialism and racism, I find it ironic that because now you've got your house in order, you're now turning your gun towards everyone else who doesn't have their house in order and then attacking them. The second thing is, Sagorika, I don't have too much time for bad faith arguments. And that is, if every day you are going to attack country A because you don't like its government and you find all its policies wrong and you support all of its opponents, I find little value in even debating stuff with you, because you're not really open to stuff. One of the major problems, and I see this in India as well, but again, from an international perspective, is there's not enough debate on policy proposals, but it's more about politics. So if you ask me, for example, as someone who works in banking and finance, I believe that the Indian proposed farm laws would have been very, very beneficial for the Indian economy. But if you ask me personally, I did look at the Citizenship Amendment Act laws, and that's something I personally was not very comfortable with, because it began linking religion with citizenship. However, what is sad to see is that if you are an opponent of the government, whether in India or you're sitting in the New York Times, you like it, you tar both laws as bad. You support the protesters on both sides, and you think that those, that the laws being repealed is somehow democratic. But if they were passed through, then that was undemocratic. It's a little sad that even highly respected commentators are unable to put away their bias that they may have for certain individuals and critique policies the way they are. On the farm laws in particular, I would say that they represent India's socialist past. They represent an Indian economy that did not grow. Almost every example of privatization in this country has worked successfully. A lot of rich India is because of the amount of growth that corporate India has seen. The fact that we had to roll back those laws and go back to archaic systems, for me, is no celebration. And when I see other media outlets indulging in this celebration or seeing it as a victory of democracy, I find it as a bad faith argument, because I would say if you do have an understanding of economics and finance, it's pretty easy to understand that these things are on the whole beneficial for the economy. But
let me just stop you there. Just to make that previous point about influencers and soft power, right? People like Trevor Noah and Russell Brand have depicted visual imagery of the protests, and they've excluded the fact that there was a man who was butchered to death. There's been no, there's been no, no FIR file. There's been nothing going on in terms of catching the culprits. There was a gang rape. There was immense spread of COVID that, the so-called protesters carried to their home states and home villages. And all of this was completely left out of the conversation when they covered the protest. However, from your perspective of the implementation of the farm laws, I think you can be a little more optimistic, considering that it is being implemented by states at their level, and a lot of states have anyway gone for it. So I believe, in order to create that political hurricane and news bite, it was a pretty effective means of both, the government and the opposition and all of the anti-establishment powers that be, including parts of the media, to get their 15 months of fame, so to speak, in that. But it is being implemented at the state level in many, many states. So I think we can at least be optimistic from a policy standpoint in that directions. Also, I would like to mention that there are many Western countries that do rank much higher than India does in terms of rape statistics, right? However, to define India by some negatives, whereas you exclude Australia, and so, like, an Indian's not going to feel threatened while going to South Africa, though the murder and the rape statistics are extremely high there. But a South African would always cite those figures for India when traveling here. So it does affect economically a lot of issues, right? Tourism, investments, all of these are affected by such news. And in that view, I would think that it's the duty of the government and of the MEA to sort of take some measures in at least ensuring that, not that there's a positive coverage, but that is accurate coverage of what we stand for and how we have progressed as a society.
Yeah, you make some good points. I would say that I believe that the MEA is generally chronically understaffed and overworked. So I'm sure in terms of priorities, perhaps going after media agencies that don't want to give you positive coverage.
But then the Prime Minister goes to Fareed Zakaria, right? Instead of somebody who can be a little more friendly, the Prime Minister actually goes and gets interviewed by Fareed Zakaria. I think only Mehdi Hassan who would have felt a little left out at that point. So that's a little, I don't know if it's what was hoped to be accomplished by such games, but it's a little, it seems a little not well thought through, to say the least. However, one last question I have before I let you go. India's language on the world stage, as you said that, since Doklam, of course, you've seen some changes, but overall, with the current establishment, with Dr. S. Jaishankar and the current cohort of people, Indian representatives in the UN, do you see that India's language has changed? We've had our Prime Minister actually openly ask for a seat at the UN SC, asking, how long we would be denied, considering our economic prowess, our prowess as a market, as a military power to be reckoned with, as a very highly populated nation, and are we much more assertive than we used to be? What do you see that remaining the case for some time? Do you see that actually helping us do anything better on the world stage?
Sure. Yeah. So I definitely do see there's a more amount of assertiveness that's there. I think it's very welcome. I think India's taking foreign policy in a much more serious way. I mean, and this is not just the government, right? This is a whole of country approach as well. If you look at Indian think tanks, which have increased, if you look at the dialogues that have been started in the last few years, but are going on from strength to strength, whether it's a Raisina dialogue or whether there's a Carnegie India Tech Forum, there's a lot more conversations that are happening. Obviously, with External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, he's been quite prolific in terms of traveling, going abroad and giving India's viewpoint. I think that's definitely beneficial, but there are limits to what that can accomplish. You had mentioned something about the UN Security Council. This is something I had actually tweeted about, just maybe a month or two ago, saying we are going to walk by the end of this decade. We are going to have this anomaly that India will have the world's largest population, and by most economic projections, it'll have the third largest GDP, not by PPP, but by nominal metrics. Yeah. And that country is going to be excluded from the UN Security Council. It would make the organization seem like a farce. It would honestly show that rules made in 1945 apparently can never ever be changed. I'm not an idealist, so I do know that changing the UN Security Council would be incredibly difficult. But we are going to come to a point where just India's scale is just going to be so large that it not being there in the Security Council as a permanent member is just going to seem very odd. Now, I don't know exactly how that could be changed. I know people have given the argument earlier that Japan used to be the world's second largest economy, and it was not given a UN Security Council permanent seat. But the argument over there is that from a strategic and defense point of view, it's a junior partner to the US. Absolutely. If India continues to grow in the next decade, what you could even have is that there could be a P5+1 sort of arrangement that's done, that even if India is not officially in it, that the 5 UNSC members are consulting with India on matters of goods. But it's an anomaly that it's unfortunate that it falls on us as being the country with the strongest case to get that change. To some extent, you would need better relations between India and China. To be honest, I am optimistic because the border dispute is not something brand new. Sagorika, we have lived with it. We've also managed to strengthen relations with China. Because it's such an opaque system, we do not know how much of this is because of President Xi Jinping. We do not know if his successor would follow similar approaches toward India. Because if you just step back and look, it's pretty strange from Beijing's point of view that it wants to tell India to not join the US, but then it sends the PLA to occupy areas that are disputed. It's almost as if it's challenging India to do something, and then when India does something, Beijing acts very surprised, saying, "Wow, how come did he do that?" So perhaps
I think, the theory put forth has been that this is to cover up that internal inefficiencies and the massive scales of corruption and economic liabilities that have been created internally, the sort of unrest within the citizens. Of course, the lockdown has only sort of exacerbated an already aggravated situation. So do you think that there is any juice to that sort of thinking, that it's not necessarily solely India versus China situation? It has to do with a lot of their internal politics.
So I actually don't think their internal situation is as bad as some hawks do say. I still see that the Chinese economy is being quite solid. I still see overall growth being pretty good over there, even with the real estate slowdown that's going to happen. I think China comprehensively is a lot stronger than India. They've been able to solve a number of issues that India no longer has. So I wouldn't really say that this was a move to distract from their internal issues. I think when it comes to their internal issues and distracting, it would be a China, US or China, Taiwan, basically that side. I just think the China-India relationship is perhaps not so important to Beijing that, the policies that are coming out aren't even in China's best interests, because I don't know why they would want to push India towards the US when India, was inviting them for summits, whether at Mahabalipuram or other places. So, leaving aside the fact that I'm an Indian, just looking from an IR scholar point of view, it's a little puzzling, because you don't really know what they wanted from this, and the reaction that they've got is exactly what was to be expected. So if they expected this reaction, then a great policy. If they didn't expect the reaction, then it's a bit of a strange policy.
Since you mentioned Taiwan, do you think India should continue to stick with a one China policy? We do, of course, but then with the threat being increasingly apparent when it comes to Taiwan, do you think India should allow for another Tibet to happen?
So I guess Tibet and China are not really comparable. What I would say is India should not really be the one to rock the boat when it comes to Taiwan politically, but that should not stop us from really, really building up our economic, our cultural, our people-to-people, our scientific ties with Taiwan.
Right.
I mean, this is a rich, developed, liberal democracy. There's so much for us to do. Tourism, flights, more trade, more investment, sending students over there to learn Chinese, just having more Indian institutes over there, more investment, getting TSMC over here. There's so much more that we can do with Taiwan that I believe India should do. I think the political aspect about recognition, that's not really something that's really up for debate by most countries, just because it would be tantamount as, almost declaring war on China. And just to remind, Taiwan itself is not claiming to be independent as yet. If it does, that's a separate issue. But absolutely, there is no reason for India to be shy in terms of not developing relations with Taiwan. At the end of the day, China is not shy when it has to, arm Pakistan to use against India. Right. I see no reason why India shouldn't do whatever it can with Taiwan.
Right. I think that sort of concludes our conversation for today, Gokul. It was an absolute pleasure having you, and I do hope to see you back at least every month. This was a very interesting conversation. I think we covered a lot of topics, and considering that IR is just so dynamic and it just keeps getting that way, I think even a decade ago we would not have been able to cover so many topics. We would probably have gone over some policy statements and just seen the progress and caught up, but I think month on month there's a lot of changes that keep happening in our sphere of this world and ecosystem. So thank you so much for joining me today, and well, I'll let you have a wonderful rest of the day ahead. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Sagorika, and best of luck with your YouTube series.
Thank you, Gokul. Bye.